Now we're ready to get started building an actual app. In this video, we'll set up a Next.js project and talk about important key concepts that you'll want to understand before we move further into the course. The first thing we'll do is open up the terminal, then run npx create react app, followed by the name of the app. And as I mentioned earlier, you'll want to make sure you're using Node.js version 12. Once that's complete, we can open up VS Code to that directory. Let's go ahead and open up the terminal and run npm run dev to make sure that the app is running locally. You should see the default homepage when you go to localhost 3000. What the dev command is doing is rendering and serving your app on the fly. You'll want to keep this command running in the background throughout the course so we can preview changes to the code as we make them. Let's explore the files in a Next project, starting with the package.json. In the scripts, you'll find the dev command, and then you'll also notice a build and start command. The build command will run your production build when you're ready to actually deploy your app, and the start command will serve that code after it's been built. We don't have to worry about those commands for the time being. In addition, in the package.json, if we go down to dependencies, you'll notice that our only dependencies are React and Next. That gives us a very light starting point with React for our front-end UI and Next to handle server-side rendering, routing, and other concerns for a full-stack application. Now, if we move back to the root directory, you'll notice a styles directory, and in this course, we'll actually be writing all of the CSS from scratch. We won't be using any CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, Tailwind, Shocker UI, or anything like that. But that being said, CSS libraries can be very useful, so feel free to add one to your project if you prefer. When it comes to styles in Next, there's one thing you should know. The globals file is where you can define CSS styles that will be applied throughout the entire application. They're not scoped or encapsulated to individual components, which means you can use them everywhere, but you might also be more likely to run into name collisions and style conflicts. But if you have other styles that really only apply to an individual page or component, you can create a CSS module. These files can be imported into a JavaScript file to be scoped into that location. When the HTML is generated, the CSS class names will be randomly generated so they don't conflict with classes used in other parts of the application. That can make it much easier to manage your CSS because you don't have to worry about name collisions or following some kind of crazy naming convention. That being said, I don't plan on spending much time talking about CSS in this course, so one thing I recommend you do is go to the main source code and copy the contents of the global CSS file. That'll just make the styling of the app look decent. It's not required, just recommended for the aesthetics. Now let's shift gears to the public directory. The public directory is where you might save things like images, favicons, or any kind of files that are just static and part of the application at all times. It's not really an important part of this course. The most important directory is the pages directory, because that defines the routing of the application as well as the components that each of those pages will route to. The root of the pages directory is like being on the root URL of your website. And when you're on the root URL, the file that it will route to is the index.js file or component. Let's go ahead and delete the main contents of this component, and you can see what we're left with is a default export of a React component. Each page file will have one default export, and that's the component that Next will render when that route is triggered in the browser. The other file you'll notice is the _app.js file, and this one serves a special purpose in Next. You can think of it as the main entry point for any page in the application. It's like a wrapper or layout that surrounds every other page. You can use it to add UI components that are available on every page, like a nav bar or footer, or as we'll see later in the course, use it to manage the authentication state on the front end. Now, you'll also notice an API directory inside of Pages. We're not going to be using API routes in this course, but it's a way to easily create a backend API to bundle JavaScript code that won't be included in your client-side application. There are times when this can be very useful, but in Next.js, we can also use get server-side props or get static props to retrieve data from the server. And for most use cases with Firebase, that's probably the better place to start. As an example, if your app is only using Firebase as a database and not using any real-time features or authentication, then you might be better off building an API route, because what it would allow you to do is only use the Firebase SDK on the server, meaning it would never have to be bundled in your client-side code, which in theory would make your app load faster by reducing the size of your JavaScript bundle. But in this course, we want all of the magic features from Firebase, so API routes aren't of much use to us. That's what a simple Next project looks like, but as your app grows in complexity, you'll likely want a place to store reusable components and also reusable libraries for code you want to implement on multiple pages. There's no standard way of doing that, but the approach that makes the most sense to me is to add a couple of root directories here, one for reusable React components and another for reusable libraries. In the components directory, we'll follow the convention of one component per file, so we might have something in there like a navbar.js component. Then the lib directory will contain libraries for any other code that we might use throughout the application, like our Firebase configuration, any helper functions, or any custom React hooks that we might create down the road. So let's go ahead and create those directories along with a few files here that we will implement later. That takes care of the setup for Next.js, but one bonus step that you may want to take is to integrate TypeScript, and that's exactly what we'll do in the next video.